You grew up inside a house that was supposed to be home, but never felt safe. There was a tension you learned to feel before you even opened your eyes in the morning. The weight in the air, the tone of a voice downstairs, that tightness in your chest that said, "Watch out." You were a child in that place. You were small in that place. And inside that place, at some point, you learned that something was wrong with you. Not with them, with you. Have you ever wondered why, even after years, after therapy, after distance, that wound still hasn't healed? Have you ever wondered why it was that specific family, those specific people, that specific house, and not another? Have you ever wondered if there's something bigger than coincidence in the fact that you were born there? Listen closely, because what's about to be said here isn't easy comfort. It's recognition. You didn't end up in that toxic family by accident. You were sent. And if something inside you held on, if you survived, if you carried it, if you're still here trying to understand, it's not because you're too weak to let go of the past. It's because you're strong enough to carry what others couldn't. The chosen aren't spared from pain. They're positioned inside it. And there's a reason for that which goes beyond any psychology, beyond any explanation the ordinary world can offer. By the end of this video, you'll understand the 4 reasons why the chosen are born into toxic families. Maybe it won't undo your pain, but it will change what that pain means. And when the meaning changes, the ground changes. And when the ground changes, you can finally stand up without trying to erase where you came from. You were the child who felt too much, not because something was wrong with you, but because you were built to feel what others ignore. While the other members of your family seemed not to notice the coldness, the chaos, the quiet cruelty, you felt every word that went unsaid, every look that hurt without touching, every silence that punished more than any scream ever could. That wasn't weakness, that was reception. You were the only one with open antennas in that environment, and open antennas inside a storm pick up everything, including what hurts. The chosen feel early, and feeling early in a family that wasn't built to hold that level of presence is like being a flame inside a room with no windows. The environment reacts, the environment suffocates. Not because the flame is wrong, but because the flame is too real for that space. You weren't too sensitive. You were too big for the container they put you in. And that hypersensitivity that isolated you as a child, that made you get called dramatic, difficult, too much, was the clearest sign that you didn't belong to the pattern of that house. Not because you were better than them, but because you carried a frequency that environment was never built to sustain. The chosen with a high calling are often placed in low-frequency families not as punishment, but as a first test of discernment. The question was never whether to adapt. The question was always to recognize the difference and not let it destroy you. You recognized it, even when you didn't know you were recognizing it. There's another sign the chosen carry from very early on, and it may be the cruelest of all: the persistent feeling of not belonging. Not the passing kind of not belonging that anyone feels sometimes. It's a structural, deep not belonging that starts at home, the one place where any human being should feel they belong unconditionally. You looked at the members of your family and felt like there was a pane of glass between you and them. You were present. You showed up for the meals, the moments, the fights, the celebrations. But there was always this transparent, uncrossable layer separating what you felt from what they felt. Like everyone else had received a manual you never got. Like everyone shared a language nobody ever taught you. You wondered if you'd been adopted. You wondered if there was something fundamentally different about you that others could see, but that you couldn't name. You wondered, in the quietest moments, whether belonging to someone was something available to you, or whether you'd been born to always stand just outside the circle. The answer the world gave you was a diagnosis, or blame, or silence. The real answer is older than any diagnosis. You didn't belong to that family the same way a diamond doesn't belong to the mud where it was found. The mud isn't the mistake. The mud is the origin. But the diamond isn't mud, and never was. The chosen are born inside systems that can't contain them because the purpose of those systems was never to cultivate the chosen. It was to force the chosen to find their own shape through pressure. Pressure makes diamonds. Thomas, 54 years old, spent most of his adult life trying to understand why, even loving his family in his own way, he could never feel like part of them. He described a specific scene. Christmas, when he was 12. Everyone sitting at the table, laughter and noise all around. And him, right there in the middle, feeling an emptiness he couldn't explain. Like he was watching a play he was cast in but had never received the full script for. Decades later, Thomas understood that emptiness wasn't the absence of love. It was the early awareness that he had been called to something that environment could not name. The not belonging in the childhood of the chosen isn't rejection, it's a filter. You were being set apart, not punished. There's an enormous difference between the two, and recognizing that difference changes everything. Rejection says you have no value. Being set apart says you have a destiny that this specific circle cannot contain. What you felt as a wound was heaven preserving your frequency from being diluted into something smaller than your calling. You were set apart so that what's inside you wouldn't get lost inside what surrounded you. And how much that hurt, how much it still hurts, sometimes, on a birthday that passed without a call, in a conversation that ended in distance, in a family photo where you feel present and absent at the same time, is directly proportional to the depth of what you carry. The unchosen don't feel that pain the same way. The unchosen adapt, mold themselves, dissolve into the family pattern without the kind of internal resistance you felt from childhood. You resisted because something in you knew. Not knew with words, knew with your body. Knew with that persistent tension. Knew with the longing for a home that no house had ever given you. Knew with that search that started so early. For meaning, for truth, for something greater than the cycle surrounding you. That knowing has no human origin. It was placed in you before you had a name. And the weight of it is physical. It's the tightness in your chest when your phone rings and you see their name on the screen. It's the tension that only shows up when you go back to that city, that street, that house. It's the exhaustion that hits after a conversation with someone who was supposed to be safe, and never was. I want to pause for a moment, because there's something that needs to be said before we go on. Maybe no one has ever put a name to the pain you've been carrying since childhood. You grew up in a place that instead of naming what was sacred in you, tried to shrink it, control it, or simply ignore it. And the silence around all of that was, many times, more cruel than any hard word that was ever said. Because the not belonging you felt in that house, the loneliness in the middle of family, has a name that goes beyond trauma. That not belonging is a mark. And marks don't show up by accident. If something in you recognizes itself as you hear this right now, don't brush it off. It's your origin confirming what has been written in you since before you had a name in this world. The Origin Codex reveals the 12 marks that were sealed in you before birth. The 12 marks that no one around you was ever able to name. Along with the Codex, you receive 7 sacred companions, 5 written guides that decode the deepest marks you carry, from the rejected child to the frequency the world called a defect, from the abundance that always slipped through your fingers to the signs that show up without explanation. Plus the complete audiobook for your quiet moments in prayer, and an audio activation sequence for each of the 12 marks you're recognizing right now. The link is in the pinned comment, but only for a limited time. Let's continue. There's a third sign that is born inside toxic families, and that the chosen carry for the rest of their lives if they never learn to name it. The weight of being the carrier. The chosen one in the dysfunctional family is rarely just a son, a daughter, a sibling. They are the emotional container of the group. They feel what the others don't process. They carry what the others deny. They lie awake at night with an anxiety that isn't entirely theirs, but that lives inside them as if it were. This has an ancient name. In Scripture, it's present in every chosen one who was called to carry something the previous generation couldn't resolve. Moses didn't just carry his people. He carried centuries of slavery that had been normalized. Joseph didn't just carry his own humiliations. He carried the hatred of an entire family that had learned to compete instead of love. Each of them was positioned inside a broken system not to perpetuate it, but to break it. You were positioned the same way. What you felt as a burden, that sense that your family's weight lands on you in a way it doesn't land on the others, is the mark of the carrier. You were chosen to carry the pain of the system to the point where it transforms. Not forever, to the point of transformation. And transformation isn't enduring indefinitely. Transformation is recognizing what you carry, naming where it came from, and refusing to pass forward what arrived at you. You were made to rescue, to restore, to heal, to set free, to lift up what had been knocked down before you were ever born. Elizabeth, 51 years old, spent decades being the person everyone in the family called when there was a crisis, when there was a fight, when there was illness, when there was a silence too heavy for anyone to break. She was the mediator, the caretaker, the one who stayed. She reached a point of exhaustion so deep she stopped being able to feel her own emotions, as if she had spent every last bit of her capacity to feel in service of others. That's when she understood there was a difference between being called to serve and being used as a dumping ground. The chosen are called to serve with authority, not to absorb without limit. The weight she carried hadn't been placed in her to destroy her. It had been placed in her so she could transform it. And transforming requires that you first stop pretending it isn't there. That's the point. The weight you carry from your family isn't normal. It isn't an unchangeable destiny. It isn't simply what happens when you're born in the wrong place. It's a calling encoded inside a pain. And like every calling, it only responds when it's named honestly, not with anger, not with resignation, but with the clarity of someone who finally understands what they're doing there. You weren't placed in that family to survive it. You were placed in that family to end what it couldn't end. And then there's the fourth sign, the quietest of all, and perhaps the most powerful, the early awakening. The chosen who are born into toxic families develop, almost without exception, a spiritual awareness that begins far earlier than the surrounding environment would be able to explain or validate. It's not something they searched for. It's something that found them. You had questions as a child that the adults around you couldn't answer. Not the questions of a curious kid, questions from someone who senses there's a deeper layer to everything, that what you can see isn't all there is, that there's something beyond the cycle of pain and repetition playing out right in front of your eyes. You felt the sacred in places where no one else seemed to feel it. In a particular quality of afternoon light, in the silence after a storm, in that space between sleeping and waking, where for a few seconds everything seemed to make sense in a way that vanished the moment you tried to hold on to it. You didn't make that up. You received it. The toxic environment around you, with all its chaos, its pain, its unpredictability, was, paradoxically, what forced that awakening to emerge sooner. When the external world is unstable, the internal world learns to be the only solid ground. When the world around you offers no safety, the soul learns to find its anchor in something beyond that world. The chosen who grew up in safe, loving, stable environments, and there are chosen among those too, often reach their awakening later because the external world offered enough substitutes for longer. But those who grew up where you grew up were forced, by the very absence of external safety, to develop a relationship with the sacred that begins in childhood, and that time does not erase. The instability of your childhood was the soil where your deepest awareness learned to grow. Daniel shares that from the age of 7, he had a habit of going to a specific corner of the backyard whenever there was tension at home. Not to play, but to be still. He didn't know what he was doing. He only knew that in that corner, in that quiet, something inside him reorganized, something held him. Decades later, he understood that what he had found in that backyard wasn't escapism. It was a chosen child, in the middle of an environment that didn't know what he was, instinctively finding the frequency that kept him whole. You did the same. In different ways, in different places, but you did the same. You were who you were, who felt what you felt, who searched for what you searched for, before you had words for it, before you had community for it, before you had any outside confirmation that what you were feeling was real. The chosen feel before they know. And that early awakening, that spiritual awareness that was born inside the chaos of your family, isn't something that happened in spite of where you came from. It's something that was activated by where you came from. The pain was the catalyst. The environment was the furnace. And what emerged inside you in that heat didn't originate in that house. It originated in something far older, far higher, and far more solid than anything that family could have given you or taken away. So look at yourself now. Not with the eyes that house taught you to use, the eyes of defect, of doubt, of the constant question of whether something is wrong with you. Look with the eyes of someone who finally has enough context to see what was always there. You were born into that family. That's a fact. You suffered in that family. That's also a fact. But there's a third truth that sits between those two, and it's the one that matters most. You were not destroyed by that family. You were formed through it. And there is an enormous difference between the two that changes everything you believe about yourself. Because destroyed would look different. Destroyed wouldn't be here. Destroyed wouldn't be searching, questioning, feeling, making it to this moment with the wound still open but the eyes still lit. What was destroyed doesn't search for meaning. What was destroyed shuts down. And you didn't shut down, even when you tried, even when it was the only way to survive, even when closing off felt wiser than continuing to feel. You didn't shut down completely, because something in you knew that shutting down would be a betrayal of what you came here to do. Think about the patterns you watched in your family. The same fights repeating themselves decades apart, but following the same script. The same silences. The same ways of hurting that passed from one generation to the next, as if they were a legitimate inheritance. As if they were inevitable. As if there were no other way to be in that bloodline. You saw that. You felt that. And at some point, maybe very early, maybe later than you'd like, you made a decision, conscious or not, that that pattern would end with you. The chosen don't break generational lines because they're better than the people who came before them. They break generational lines because they were equipped, before birth, with the ability to see what others inside the system cannot see. It's like being the only one awake in a room where everyone is asleep. It's not a credit to the one who's awake. It's a function. It's a calling. It's the reason you were sent to that specific house, that specific family, at that specific moment in the generational line. You weren't rejected by that family. You were assigned to it. Let that distinction settle into your heart, because it changes the entire story of your life. Rejection is abandonment without purpose. Assignment is placement with intention. What you lived through was too painful to be mere accident, and too sacred to be mere punishment. There is an intelligence behind the place where you were born that surpasses any explanation psychology or sociology could offer. Heaven doesn't place a chosen one inside a broken system for them to be consumed by it. Heaven places a chosen one inside a broken system because that chosen one carries the frequency needed to keep that system from going on indefinitely. You are the end of a cycle. And the end of a cycle doesn't look like victory when you're in the middle of it. It looks exactly like you felt. Lost, different, carrying something no one around you could name. Searching for a belonging that the family environment could never provide because your true belonging lies beyond that circle. Stephen, 48 years old, spent years in anger. A justified, legitimate anger, built on decades of not being seen inside his own family. He described the moment the anger began to shift not as a sudden forgiveness, not as a reconciliation, but as an understanding. He said it was like someone had turned on a light in a room he'd always navigated in the dark. The furniture was still in the same place. The pain of bumping into things was still real. But now he could see the whole room, and seeing the whole room changed how he moved through it. He didn't need to love what had been done to him. He needed to understand why he had been placed there to receive it, and what he was supposed to do with what he had survived. Understanding doesn't erase. Understanding sets free. And freedom, for the chosen, isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to carry the pain without being defined by it. It's knowing that what happened to you is not what you are. It's recognizing that the family you were born into was the first chapter of a story that isn't over yet, and that the chapters ahead are being written right now, by you, with the awareness of someone who finally understands what they've always carried. The mark calls. It always calls. If you've made it this far, something needs to be said plainly. You weren't looking for entertainment when you started listening to this. You were looking for confirmation. Confirmation that what you've always felt, that persistent sense of being different, of carrying something others don't carry, of having come from a place of pain without that pain being the end of the story, is real. It's legitimate. It has a name, and it has a purpose. The 4 sides you just recognized, the hypersensitivity the family environment didn't know how to hold, the not belonging that was a filter and not a rejection, the weight of being the carrier of generational pain, and the early spiritual awakening that was born inside the chaos. Those signs don't exist in isolation. They form a map. And like every map, it only works for those willing to walk. You walked all the way here. If something in you recognized itself in this video, write in the comments the word that hit you the hardest. It could be one of the marks you recognized. It could be a phrase that landed differently. It could be just one word that describes what you're feeling right now. Naming your feeling is a spiritual act for the chosen who have spent their whole lives without having their names called for what they truly are. Writing it here is driving a stake into the ground and saying, I know what I am. I recognize where I came from, and I choose to understand what that means. You are not alone anymore. You never were. What was sealed in you is rising. What was hidden is being seen. You are awakening to your origin.